Hey, welcome to Slick Talk. It's been a minute since I got a video out, so this is my first step back, and hopefully you guys are here for the ride. And I plan to be a lot more regular this time. So looking forward to connecting with everyone, getting everyone subscribed, and getting this thing on the road. So let's do it. Did you know that median black wealth is projected to be $0 by 2053? In sharp contrast, white median wealth, the number for them by 2053 is $137,000. I got to be honest with you for a second. Sometimes it's really hard for me to get excited about the conversations we're having now around racial justice because I think understanding white supremacy really is the beginning. It's a right first step. What we need to do is go deeper and get specific about how white wealth in American society was largely built and created through government transfers of wealth, and why reparations are integral to lifting black people and making sure that black people don't keep this status as like this permanent underclass in American society. You know, despite being here the entire time and watching this immigrant group and that immigrant group from Europe just come and assimilate and, you know, rise, change their economic fortunes. Um, we really need to talk about how reparations is going to be integral to bridging this wealth gap. We know that in the slavery era, the slave owners, some plantation owners, were some of the wealthiest people in American society at the time. And it had a lot to do with them owning enslaved people and producing these commodities that were so vital to the American economy. At the same time, white people were being granted millions and millions of acres of land that had just been stolen from Native Americans in the West, in what was the Western territories. And basically, through things like the Indian Removal Act and the Homestead Act, they were granted these large plots of land basically for free to develop. Even in the height of the Civil War, the federal government paid some reparations to slave owners whose enslaved people were freed through the Emancipation Proclamation. One thing to walk away with is that when it comes to white people, the American government is dead set on protecting their economic position through securing their ability to build wealth, to have wealth and build it, and helping them get more of it above all else. So I always just wonder, why does it seem as outlandish when black people ask for the same thing today? Let's move on. The abolition of slavery was followed by sharecropping, where formerly enslaved people were indebted to their former slave owners. They were working the land as sharecroppers that they were formerly enslaved on. And there's still black people today who live on the land that they were sharecroppers on, and probably their ancestors were enslaved on. The era of Reconstruction, a period of 10 to 15 years where the federal government provided limited support for formerly enslaved people, saw improvements in schooling and saw black people really beginning to lay the foundations of thriving communities. But that was met with the system of Jim Crow, which is basically legal segregation. And that segregation ensured that white people had the best communities, the best schools, the best resources, and black people got what was on the side and what was left over. This period spans between the 1870s and around 1965. But remember, I'm not just here to give you history. We're talking about wealth. We're here to talk about wealth transfers, how government transfers create wealth for groups of people, namely white people. And that's exactly what happened between this period of the 1870s up and through 1965. The Jim Crow era is characterized by the emergence of the largest and most prosperous wealthiest middle class that the world has ever seen. And it just so happened to be that that middle class was created through government action, through major federal legislation that made that possible. And it was also deliberately created to be exclusively white, right? This system of legal segregation that was dominant in the South, this Jim Crow system, those representatives were in Congress. And they worked with the Democratic Party to ensure that segregation, was the law of the land where they lived, also made its way into major federal legislation because for them it was a way of life thing. Black people cannot be equal with white people. They're not entitled to the same benefits and anything the government has to offer. So when we talk about the New Deal and when we talk about the creation of Social Security and labor rights and union protections and minimum wage, we have to also acknowledge that those were created in an era where segregation was dominant, and those representatives from the South, those senators, and it's not just from the South either, because the whole party, the whole country went on with this. But Jim Crow made it into major federal legislation, including all of the New Deal programs, and that had the effect of excluding black people from the programs that were most responsible for creating white wealth and creating the white middle class that we know today. And let me just go to my notes real quick because I want to make sure I get this point right. During this period, formerly enslaved people and their descendants were paying taxes like any other American was, but they were excluded from benefiting from government policies like Social Security, unemployment, the minimum wage, union protections, and unions being openly allowed to discriminate against black people and prevent them from joining, thus preventing them from enjoying the benefits of stronger wages and health care that unions fought for and pensions. And even many black veterans were denied benefits after they came home from the war. And these were educational benefits. These were benefits that allowed a new generation of people to get a college education. It wasn't something that people commonly did. The GI Bill changed that. And because the GI Bill was administered in a racist way, many black people, black deserving GIs, were completely excluded from that. The GI Bill alone provided over $14.5 billion in economic assistance that was directly from the federal government, and that was used to pay for 4.3 million mortgages. And it also was used to pay for education for 8 million GIs between the 1940s and the 1950s. So that's a huge amount of people that were lifted up by this. And we know that there were so many black people fighting in the war, and the fact that they were excluded from this massive government program that helped so many people, helped so many white people come home and put their lives back together and put their families back together. That had a huge impact in how black communities are faring today and how white communities are faring today. Because if you give us 14.5 billion into our communities to figure out what to do with, I bet you it's going to look a little bit different for us a little bit later. But I digress. The mother of all racist ass programs, I mean the GOAT, just the greatest, is the Federal Housing Administration. This agency created the wealth that most Americans used to buy their first home, and that many are still passing down in one way or another to their children and grandchildren. This is not an exaggeration. The Federal Housing Administration created urban ghettos characterized by disinvestment and poverty for black people and secure suburban communities for white people. I'm going to borrow from PBS to make this point for real, because I know I might sound like I'm crazy, but y'all got to trust PBS, because I think they the government too. The government set up a national neighborhood appraisal system explicitly tying mortgage eligibility to race. Non-white neighborhoods were deemed financial risks and made ineligible for home loans, a policy today known as redlining, because they literally drew lines in red around black communities and said, don't give loans here. And then they drew green lines around white communities and they were like, go, give them lots of money. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion of home loans. That is so much money. More than 98% of that went to white people. Of the 350,000 new homes built with federal support in Northern California between 1946 and 1960, fewer than 100 of those went to African Americans. These government programs made possible the new segregated white suburbs that sprang up around the country after World War II. Government subsidies for municipal services helped develop and enhance these suburbs further, in turn fueling commercial investments. Freeways tied new suburbs to central business districts, but they often cut right through the vitality of non-white neighborhoods in the central city. So if you guys are familiar with New York City, there's something called the Cross Bronx Expressway. It literally is a giant freeway that cuts straight through the borough and through a bunch of neighborhoods. All where that, every piece of land where that freeway is, cut right through a thriving community when it was built. And this is what they were doing. We were getting our communities slashed and cut up and banned from getting loans, and white people were just signing 30-year mortgages for the first time with federally backed loans to the tune of $120 billion worth in aid in total. And that number is just between 1934 and 1962. All right, so let me get to the bottom line and wrap this up because it's going on a little long. We just talked through about 200 years of direct land transfers, financial assistance, education assistance, and homeownership assistance that is directly responsible for making white Americans the largest and wealthiest group of people that the world has ever known. How did we get there? And I just laid out how we got there. Talking about the history in this way, it sort of begins to reveal how a lot of the bootstraps myth is just that, a myth, because it took so much assistance to create the middle class and the wealth that white people have today. Wealth is different from income in that it gets passed down for generations. It's the value of your home, right? It usually grows over time. And so if I give somebody's great granddaddy $1,000 in 1922, what is that $1,000 worth today? Probably a lot more. And you can take advantage of that when you have wealth to begin with, right? But if you don't have any, then there's nothing to grow. The civil rights movement did a ton to basically dismantle the system of Jim Crow and a system of legal explicit discrimination. But what we need to do in this generation is start to tackle these issues around economics, around wealth, around what's in people's pocketbooks, what's in their wallets, what's their home worth. Why is it that black people are such a low percentage of homeowners in this country? And we need to really concern ourselves with the economic side of things, because it's not that the work is finished on the sides of sort of getting equal treatment under the law. We know that that's not the case, but we're always going to be in this lower economic position as a demographic group if we don't get serious in making the economic demands just as loud as some of the maybe identity demands that we have. I just want to emphasize something I mentioned at the beginning. Median black wealth is on its way to be $0 by 2053. That is not a long time from now. This economic stuff, this wealth stuff, this is what Dr. King was pivoting to before he was assassinated, right? this is that next step. This is our next piece of work. Let's get on. Let's get serious about black economics, right? So, actually, one last question: is this really that complicated? Right? Is it really that complicated? If government action is responsible for creating most of the wealth that white people enjoy today, how can we build wealth for black communities? What is needed in order to truly rectify this legacy of slavery and subjugation that American history is still grappling with, right? What's needed? I really think it takes everyone quitting the pussyfooting around reparations. We got to talk about it. It has to be wealth transfers. Financial assistance has to be a part of the conversation around all of these things. Otherwise, we're basically going to continue to fill this role in American society. And I'm talking as a demographic group. I know that there are many middle class black people today. There are many black people that probably got more money than some white people. I'm sure that exists. We all know celebrities. We all know that this exists. This is not 1965. But as a group, the masses of black people, our poverty rates, our home ownership rates, and every economic indicator, we look like a permanent underclass in American society. And if we don't get serious about addressing that, that's exactly how that's going to stay. We're going to continue to live in communities that are disinvested in, that have poor education, at the mercy of police forces that see themselves as primarily responsible for managing an undesirable and unwanted underclass of people. Okay? So we have to talk about this, and this is, I think, it has to be the next big conversation that we have. But listen, the conversation is not over. I hope I began to scratch the surface, and I hope we can continue to talk about this. So why don't you guys go to my page and hit that subscribe button, and then take yourself into the comments. Let me know. Did I miss anything? Did I get anything wrong? Do you disagree? Don't tell me if you disagree. I don't care. No, I'm joking. I want to hear it. Let me know. Let me know your thoughts. Leave a comment, subscribe, and I will see you at the next time.